In this nugget, I'd like to chat with you about solving the problem of availability in the event that the namespace server goes down. In our previous nugget, we set up DFS and namespace. So DCNug is our namespace server, and server 2 and server 3 are DFS replication capable. And we configured a replication group so that these two are replicating with each other. Now the challenge is if DCNug is powered off or is unreachable, that's a problem for our users, because if they try to go to the resource at nuggetlab.com, DFS_root, and the namespace server isn't available, the client is not going to be able to be referred to the share either on server 2 or server 3. So during the install, we selected domain-based namespace, and we also had the option of a standalone namespace. So if we only intend on having one server acting as the namespace server, it really doesn't matter too much if we do standalone or domain-based, because we don't have any fault tolerance. But since we selected domain-based, what we can do is we can go ahead and add a second namespace server to support that namespace. And that way, if either of the namespace servers is unreachable or goes down, a client making a request for that virtualized share supported by namespace will still have a server, if we have two of them, that can respond and then refer that client to one of the shares where they can get the actual files and content on those shares. And here's what I propose that you and I do. We do not have fault tolerance on several things. For example, we don't have two domain controllers. So let's fix that. DCNug is a domain controller. And what I've done is I've added the Active Directory role to server 2, and I promoted server 2 to a domain controller. And because we've already walked through that previously in this course, I thought I'd save you the extra steps of just adding the role and promoting it. And then now, with two domain controllers, let's also add server 2 as a second namespace server. And that way, when the client makes a request, if one of the namespace servers is unavailable, the other namespace server can respond to the client. So what we'll have is we'll have DCNug and server 2 both acting as namespace servers. And at the moment, for DFS replication, we have server 2 and server 3. And what I would like to do in preparation for setting up some different topologies regarding DFS, I'd also like to add the replication capability over to DCNug. And that way we'll have more than just two servers that are doing the DFS replication piece, and we can have additional topologies. So we'll do this in two logical steps. Let's add the namespace server functionality to server 2 first, and then we'll add the replication functionality over to DCNug. And then once those bits are in place, we'll go ahead and configure server 2 to actually act as a namespace server, and that'll give us the fault tolerance for our existing namespace. And because we have the remote server administrative tools right here on our Windows client, let's do most of the work from our Windows client in the hands-on lab. So here in our Windows client, let's go ahead and launch the PowerShell scripting environment. There's a shortcut right here on the taskbar for that. We'll say yes to user account control. And it looks like I did not close this cleanly last time. So I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. It'll bring up the previous session. That's perfect. That's exactly what we need. And when you do this lab, if you want to open up this file, just go ahead and click on File, click on Open, and then in the temp folder, there's a file called Add Namespace to server2-nug. So the first step is to go ahead and check for the DFS namespace functionality on server 2. Now the namespace server should not be installed, just the replication piece. However, we can verify that with the command get-windows feature-computer name server2-nug space fs-dfs*, and we'll launch that with an F8. And that looks great. So replication is in place, the namespace server function isn't. So we can add that functionality with the invoke-command-computer name server2-nug-command, and then in curly brackets, install Windows feature fs-dfs-namespace -include management tools, and then we'll close the curly bracket and we'll launch that with an F8. And that shouldn't take too long to install. And while we're here, let's go ahead and check on DCNug with the get-windows feature space-computer name dc-nug fs-dfs*, and it's got the namespace service. And let's go ahead and also add to that with line 7 here the DFS replication piece. So with row 7 highlighted, we'll do F8. And we'll add the replication piece on DCNug that we can use later as well. Great, so that's done. Let's go ahead and minimize the scripting environment. And let's launch Server Manager right here on the client. We'll give that a few moments to initialize. And then we'll click on Tools, and from the drop down, we'll go to DFS Management. So currently we have the namespace for nuggetlab.com DFS_root. We've got one folder, and we've got a couple of folder targets associated with that. If we double click on DFS folder, the folder targets are share on server 2 and on server 3. Fantastic. So what we want to do is we want to add a new namespace server to support the namespace functionality. So to do that, we'll go ahead and click on nuggetlab.com DFS_root, And with that selected, over here on the right, let's click on Add Namespace Server. We'll go ahead and click on Browse. And let's put in Server 2's name, server2-nug. We'll click on Check Names, and then click on OK. And let's also click on Edit Settings. And for our lab, we're choosing all users have read and write permissions. We'll click OK, click on OK again, and we're done. So now if we click on Namespace Servers, we've got two namespace servers. We've got DCNug and Server 2. So let's minimize the DFS Management Console. Let's minimize Server Manager. Now, to test this from the client, let's go ahead and turn off DCNug. We'll power them off completely. And then on the client, we'll go to nuggetlab.com, dfs_root. And even though one of our namespace servers is not available, because Server 2 is, it should still be able to respond to us and then refer us to one of the two shares on either Server 2 or Server 3, so we can still get access to the resources. So up here on DCNug, so let's verify that we're on DCNug. That's a good start, making sure we're shutting down the right server. And we'll click on the Windows icon in the bottom left-hand corner, and then click on the power icon, and then click on Shutdown, and click on Continue. And that is going off into the dark. Goodbye, DCNug. We'll see you in a little while. So with DCNug off, let's go back to our client. So here at the client, let's click on File Explorer from the taskbar. And let's type in the path nuggetlab.com and then dfs_root and press enter. And cross our fingers. And there it is. And that did take a few seconds to happen, but there's our DFS folder. And we double click on that. And those shares are either on Server 2 or Server 3. And because the packets never lie, if we open up Wireshark here on the client by clicking on the icon in the taskbar, giving it a moment to initialize, and then double click on Ethernet 1, start capturing packets. If we minimize that, and then, for example, go into one of these files, we'll double click on Created on Server 2, and type in this is a test, and then we'll do a file and a save, and then we'll close it. In modifying that file as a client, we're actually working with one of those two servers, Server 2 or Server 3. And then in the background, Server 2 and Server 3 are going to replicate the updated information to keep it consistent. So let's go back to Wireshark by clicking on the icon. We'll click on Stop to stop the capture. Let me bring this full screen. I'm also going to click on View and then turn off the packet bytes. So here we have some file activity regarding the file that we just opened that's related to Server 2. Now, another way we could do this is we could do a display filter. So if we did a IP-ADDR = 192.168.1.102 and pressed enter as a display filter, that'll show us any packets that had that IP address present in it. If we change that to .103, which is Server 3's address, and pressed enter, we got nothing. There was no communications during this packet capture that involved the IP address of .103. So the namespace server referred the client to the share on Server 2, as opposed to the share on Server 3. So we'll go ahead and close Wireshark. I'll say quit without saving. And because replication is happening in the background, if we went directly to Server 2 and Server 3 to those shares, we would see that the content has been replicated with the updates that we just made on both those server shares. In this nugget, we added a second namespace server to help with the availability of namespace in the event that a single server goes down. And I would invite you to lab this up and practice in the hands-on labs that we've provided right here at CBT Nuggets. So have some fun with that, and I'll see you in the next video. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.